Thanks everyone for joining today's Space Syntax Lab seminar. I'm really excited to welcome Christina and Gustavo today to talk about social housing in London and Vienna. Gustavo has a background in architecture and holds an MSc in Space Syntax from UCL. Currently, he works as global product manager at Rappi, where he oversees the logistics operations in various Latin American cities. In 2021, he founded IDA, a company that combines data analysis and architectural planning. Gustavo has published research on placemaking in a digital era and constructing socio-spatial maps from social media data, which he presented in the last Space Syntax Symposium. In addition, he contributed to the European Parliament Buildings Conference with research that combines architecture, politics, and technology. Christina Lenart is an architect and scholar who studied at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, the KTH in Stockholm, and also holds an MSc in Advanced Architectural Studies here from UCL. She worked in an architectural practice in Vienna for the Arc Plus journal in Berlin and has been a researcher and teacher at the Technical University in Vienna. Christina's work focuses on the societal, architectural, and urban aspects of housing. Currently, she works independently as a researcher and architectural designer and serves as the housing lead at a social organizations department for research and innovation. She also guest edited an issue of Arc Plus discussing contemporary Viennese housing developments and emerging building types that serve multiple urban functions. And with this, I'm really looking forward to a presentation of the two. And before we start, I'd like to emphasize, if there are any questions during the talk, please put them in the chat so we can address them at the Q&A at the very end. And with this, I'd like to hand over to Gustavo and Christina.
Yeah, thank you, Kimon, for the nice introduction. Hello, everyone. We are very excited about this opportunity to present our work today and to share it with you. And we are very much looking forward to our discussion later on. And at the beginning, we also want to thank Sofia Spsara, professor at the Bartlett, who actually connected us too, because we conducted this research between Ecuador and Austria. And the work you are going to see today, it's part of a bigger research project which was funded by the city of Vienna and was done at the time when I was still working for the Technical University in Vienna. So, Gustavo.
Yeah, well, a quick introduction about myself as well. Thank you very much, Kim, and all for being here on this seminar. As Christina mentioned, we are looking forward to present this work that we worked for more than 6 months last year, and it was very interesting to touch about this topic of social housing, also in how it relates with the city, with the spatial analysis, and how these results can provide some discussions for the future. So yeah, thank you very much everyone for joining, and I hope that you enjoy the presentation, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask at the end.
So currently we are facing a housing crisis. Many European cities are rethinking their social housing programs. Cities like Berlin or London are developing strategies for either gaining back their social housing stock or building new affordable flats. While cities are predominantly dealing with the question of how to make living affordable, another question of high importance is what makes actually social housing social. So looking at different countries or cities, it becomes obvious that there are many different concepts and definitions of what social housing is. However, in many cities, the way social housing was integrated into the city caused social problems. It created ghettos at the edges of the cities, and these areas became stigmatized places to live in. The social housing estates in the two cities we looked at in our research, so London and Vienna, don't follow this pattern of concentrating social housing at the outskirts. However, in both cities there were large estates built, which for themselves almost formed kind of neighborhoods. So both cities, London and Vienna, have a long history of large-scale communal social housing. However, the housing situation in both cities today is greatly different. Both cities started with big social housing programs at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. And they both continued building large-scale social housing until post-World War II period. A quarter of UK's housing was council housing by 1960. Bombing sites and inner city slums were purchased by councils as well as peripheral sites for redevelopment under modernist standards. It was during the 1970s and 1980s that when the public debate and attitude towards social housing became more critical and sharper in the UK, and the government decided to shift the mission of providing social housing to housing associations. So what you see in this drawing is an image of Vienna's communal housing. So in Vienna, social housing is consisting of two parts. One is communal housing and one is cooperative subsidized housing. And here you see only the communal housing projects, which was basically what the city of Vienna started with in their social housing program. And you see how the communal housing is distributed over the city. So it's like at this stage it's enfolding the whole city's surface, and you see over time and over the whole area of the city of Vienna how the projects spread over the whole area actually, and have very different sizes also. And what is characteristic, what is also visible in the drawing that you saw before, is a concept that Vienna has been following since the very beginning. They call it social mixing. So the idea is that social housing is addressing people with also middle class income, so that within buildings, within neighborhoods, and also over the whole area of the city, the idea is to really mix people with different income. So this is some of the ideal idea that they were following. So during the last years, there has been a reorientation also in the London housing strategy, and the number of newly constructed social housing has been recently rising again. In Vienna, we can see a little bit an opposite development. The social housing, so the social housing that was built remained quite constant, but there was a big boom of privately financed housing, which is starting to become a problem in Vienna. Another different, oh wait, one back, Gustavo. Another difference which is important to mention is that also, as I said before, also London and Vienna have very different definitions what social housing is. So they have various types of housing formats, both rented and privately owned, and they all meet their own definition of social and affordable housing. So just that, yeah. Just at the beginning to make clear that the definitions diverge quite a lot, and this we were taking into consideration when we were choosing our case studies. So what we can see now in both cities, if you look at the social housing that is produced today and the role of architecture, is that in London there were a couple of experiments where good architecture was could be found also in social housing projects, like the project that you see, the projects that Peter Barber architects were building, or Richard Rogers, were all attempts to bring back architectural quality into the discourse on social housing. so that affordable housing doesn't necessarily mean that it's cheap in production. But if we are looking back into London's social housing history, architecture was often blamed to be the reason for different problems that occurred on the sites of council estates. One of the first housing types that was widely criticized in politics, media, and the public discourse were high-rise buildings in the 1970s, especially after the partial collapse of Ronan Tower after an explosion. And this led to a loss of public confidence in high-rise housing. And more council estates followed on the list of failures. And also the political discourse was playing an important part and in the development of this project. In 1997, you see now Tony Blair on this image, which was spreaded very much. This was the time when he made his first speech as prime minister at the Aylesbury estate, which is home to 7,500 people. And he was addressing the poorest people in our country, as he said, that have been forgotten by government. So this estate was often called as the most notorious estate in Britain, and was serving at this media setting as a background setting. And later he also started using the term sink estates during the which came into usage during the 1980s, and also created a strong image and reinforced a sense of segregation of these places and the people that lived there. And also, when we continue the political discourse, David Cameron had also a strong position towards estates. He campaigned for demolishing a lot of them and rebuild them by private investors. And he also stated that people can feel trapped in poverty, called them brutal high-rise towers and dark alleyways. And he said that they were a gift to criminals and drug dealers. So very strong expressions and emotionalized words that he was using when speaking about these places and estates. So much of the public critique on council estates pointed at a kind of a ghettoization and segregation from the city, and also this way of speaking about them reinforced this notion. The public discourse in Vienna on social housing is a very different one. On the one hand, housing is a political issue more on a municipal level rather than on a national level. And on the other hand, Vienna hardly had to deal with such severe cases of crime and deprivation. Even though there are some cases where there were some problems and also bad reputations. Am Schöpfwerk is one of these projects that you will later get to know. And there have been also famous negative voices. For example, architect and theoretician Manfredo Tafuri. He wrote that the architecture of Red Vienna also said that it was creating enclaves cut off from the city. And later on, we are going to see a project from Red Vienna where we are also somehow trying to check if he was right with this. So large part of the Viennese discourse on social housing is actually a story of success. Also internationally speaking, the international public discourse is usually a very positive one, but it's mainly focusing on affordability or the number of newly built flats. Architectural or spatial qualities are not used as like the major role in the argumentation. So undoubtedly, the success or failure of housing estates is a complex issue and cannot be ascribed solely to politics, administration, urban planning, architecture, the building quality, or the provision of facilities, or the socio-economic composition of the inhabitants. But it is indisputable that architecture and urban planning have at least a role to play. We saw it that it had also a role to play on a populistic level in UK, in the example of London. So therefore, this research takes an attempt to take a close look at these arguments, and it investigates what the factual role of architecture is in making the state either an integrated component of a city or a segregated island.
Perfect. Yeah, well, apart from that, with all this background, we recently also asked ChatGPT to provide us with a table comparison the history of these two cities in terms of social housing. And it's really interesting because this artificial intelligence fits itself from the information available on the internet, on articles, on books. And it's really summarized so very much some of the topics about the public discourse that Christina just mentioned about both cities. In terms of location, London has been characterized like historically located in poor or managed areas. These kind of projects. In terms of land uses, these projects are often said to be surrounded by industrial or commercial uses and with a lack of green spaces. Also, in the architectural design, London social housing projects, it says that utilitarian design is pretty much focused on the architecture and little attention to aesthetics. And the public policy of the whole UK government is focused on provide cheap, available units for the people. And this creates a really good contrast with Vienna social housing because, as Christina mentioned, the public discourse is very positive here and says in terms of location that probably you can, social housing projects in Vienna are located in various neighborhoods, including the center and suburban areas, with mixed use neighborhoods with access with green spaces and amenities. So very positive reference. And also in terms of architectural design, it says that attention to aesthetics with ornate design and use of high quality materials is an important factor. And of course, that the city is focused on providing affordable housing that is actually have a high quality. So this summary of all these characteristics is going to be tested during this research because, of course, this is the public discourse that can be found in many internet articles or researches. But to what extent this relates to the spatial relationship at an urban level or an architectural level is something that we wanted to test on this research.
So our research objective, if we sum it up, our main questions were, what is the relevance of location and ground floor spaces in making a social housing project successful? And how can we measure if a social housing project is an integrated or segregated component of a city? And next, next, Gustavo. So we started to somehow set up how we could structure our methodology and created organized it according to 3 layers: the city scale, the neighborhood scale, and the building scale. And what we are going to show you today are actually, we are focusing on, I know it's a bit too small on my screen. So we are focusing mainly on the larger city scale. So how does the design of the project match with the configuration of the city background, for example, where questions in the course of our research, and on the neighborhood level. So what kind of spaces do these projects provide? On the neighborhood scale, we looked at uses, and we also looked at really the ground floor spaces in terms of their architectural definition. So we picked 6 case studies, 3 in London and 3 in Vienna, and according to certain criteria. So first we tried to find always in both cities 2 projects that have a similar historical context. So Boundary Estate in London and Rabenhof in Vienna, they were both part of the first phase of social housing. So in Vienna, Red Vienna housing program, and in London, the Housing of the Working Classes Act, and have a similar size in terms of flats. So they have a similar number of flats. And then also the size of the project was important to us. So there are always project couples. So both Boundary Estate and Rabenhof have a similar size. Maiden Lane and Am Schopfwerk are both post-war projects and have both almost similar size. It was not always easy to find. And then the youngest projects are the smallest ones. And this was actually the most difficult thing to find, because the projects in London became very small, actually, what the projects that call themselves social housing or affordable housing. So we have now here a very small project as a case study. At the same time, the project in Vienna also shrunk. So we also have a relatively small project for the youngest ones. Then what was also criteria was the location. So all projects are more or less rather central, even though the two youngest projects are a bit further outside, but are still within the main city area. And then we were also interested in a large diversity of architectural and urban typologies. So these were the criteria according to which we were deciding which project we should take. So to just briefly tell you a little bit about the project. So Boundary Estate, the oldest one in London, it was built on a site which was available after a slum clearance. And the flats are today still largely owned by the council. And you can still find a lot of retail spaces there. And yeah, it's following actually a similar street pattern like this as the surrounding. Maiden Lane Estate, which I'm going to now tell you a little bit more about, because we are also going to focus on this project later on in the research. It's a low-rise, high-density project. But it's important to know that actually it was only fragments of the original plan were realized. It was split in several phases of development, and in the course of development, there were different administrative and political decisions that really changed the original plan. So important pedestrian connections were altered, and most of the other functions, which additional to housing, were not realized anymore. And the whole project was also the mix of people was, especially in the second phase, very much focusing on people who had very low income. So you had a strong focus on people with low income. And the project suffered from a really bad image as a result of malaise and crime. And it started a really wide debate on this estate, but not only on this estate. An investigation was commissioned, which was not only criticizing this estate, but you could say modernist architecture in general. So the conclusion was that architecture had failed. And as a reaction, Bill Hillier also criticized the report and made another analysis of Maiden Lane, which you might all know, stating that that the study had mixed up the failure of management, technical and social issues with architecture. Today, what we call now Maiden Lane Estate, there are two existing blocks were demolished, new flats were built, and with the money that was generating by selling the new flats, refurbishment was financed. But still, most of the flats from stage 1 and 2 of the development are still owned by this council. The last London project, Macgrath Road, it's a shared ownership project with starter homes for young families. So on the long term, it's going to be also privately owned. And it's meant as a reinterpretation of the so-called back-to-back housing typology from the late 19th century. The case studies in Vienna. So Rabenhof is one very famous example of Red Vienna's municipal housing program. In Vienna, after the end of World War I, the housing conditions were very bad, high unemployment, and the city council initiated a housing program that was financed by municipal housing taxes, and they produced in total 64,000 flats of affordable housing for the working class, starting from 1923. The interesting thing about Rabenhof is that it's a sequence of several courtyards which are permeable. You can go through them. It has a high mixture of different uses. It's located quite central in the city. And yeah, and the flats are still all owned by the city of Vienna, because Vienna generally hasn't sold any, or hardly has sold any of its communal municipal housing. Am Schöpfwerk is the largest project. It's located in Vienna south, and it was similarly a little bit similar to Maiden Lane. It had a very long planning phase with a lot of changes, and it was built. So the underground station was built much later, as it should have been, which was also a little bit of a problem. And this is one of the few housing projects in Vienna which had not a rather bad reputation, and they had some issues where the city of Vienna was putting a lot of effort to improve the situation there. The architecture is also, it's a sequence of different courtyards. It was meant to be a reinterpretation of the Viennese courtyard typology, as we can see it at the Rabenhof. And it has a lot of arcades and passages that are structuring the open spaces of this car-free area, actually, and a lot of different other uses as well. And yeah, one of the main critiques was also that it was very monofunctional in terms of its functions, and also in terms of how the inhabitants was mixed. So a very large part of the inhabitants is receiving housing subsidies, which is usually not the case in other projects. And the last one, Ellerlingenshof, built in the 1990s. It's also communal housing, which is a very open courtyard, and has a very large open space at the center, and creates kind of, it's a bit hard to see on the image now, but it has large staircases which are creating kind of a tribune in the center. So you will see it in the plans later on. And it also has some additional functions, such as a kindergarten or a community center.
Yep. So knowing this background of the 6 projects, now we're going to explain a few methodologies that we use on the project. First, the first one related to space syntax. Space syntax is a well-known theory and set of methodologies that enable us to compare two cities due to the way that normalized values are calculated. So it was a good method that we choose in order to compare these two completely different cities, as it is London and Vienna. For the people that does not have so much context on space syntax on the seminar, space syntax measure specifically 2 measures that we are going to focus on this research. That is integration, that measure the centrality of places or streets, in this case of social housing projects, and how these locations tend to have more land uses, or tend to be the location where the people go. And the other metric is choice, where is measured to what extent each street or segment of street have the probability or likeliness to be have movement flows by car or by foot, because it has the shortest path to connect all the streets to other streets. So that's what we're going to focus on, that 2 metrics. The 2 metrics that we are going to be analyzed has been normalized in order to compare project to project. And as well, For the ones that doesn't have too much context on space syntax, always the red colors mean high values of these two metrics, and the blue colors lower values of these two metrics. So starting with the case studies in London, as we mentioned at the beginning of the research, Boundary Estate, Maiden Lane Estate were located on the very center of the city of London, and the later project of McCart Road is located on the east, where currently there are many new developments of housing happening at the moment. These projects, in terms of a special configuration, varies a lot, so we will touch very briefly the main characteristics on each one of them to see to what extent we can say that these projects are located in an integrated part or segregated part of the city. Starting with Boundary Estate, the oldest project in London, we can see at a global scale, and something that we also measure for all the project was to focus on the global and local scale. Global, running analysis, topological analysis of 10,000 meters to see what is the connection to the city, and local on an 800 meters radio to see how these projects are related to the neighborhood where they are located. So on Boundary Estate, we can see that on a global scale, the project is not from the values, is only well connected by the main city located at the west of the project. As you can see on NANCH, the value NANCH 10,000, and on integration, similar values in general. At the local level, on the neighborhood scale, we can see that even though this is the more central project of all the three in London, the values are very focused on the main street, which doesn't have too much connection with where the current flats of the projects are located. Then going to Maiden Lane Estate, the one that, as Christina mentioned, was very criticized due to many publications about the location that is currently next to train tracks. We can see on the global analysis that the project itself has only one big connection, that is the main street located on the east side of the part, and much of the interior of the project is very segregated on integration and choice values. This could also relates to the values at a local level, on a neighborhood level, because we can see the same tendency that these streets inside the projects are not well connected to the surroundings of the neighborhood. Probably some things that could argue for that argument that the project at itself is working on an island in the zone close to King Cross Station. Later, the final project of McCart Road, that is a very small project compared to the other ones. At a global scale, of course, to being at the edge, not at the edge, but not so central as the other two projects, have lower values of connectivity in general to the city. And at the local level, perhaps the main city located at the west of the project has high values, which can show that maybe in this neighborhood, it becomes kind of next to a centrality. It's worth to mention in here that we are not saying that because a project is located far away from the center or only in residence areas is going to be segregated, but due to the space constructions that both cities have at the moment, and of course that the developments are pushing far and far away, this is something that is going to happen. The important thing here is that this special configuration foster land uses and community that we later are going to see on the research. Then changing to Vienna, and again, touching very briefly on the three projects. The main difference here is that the oldest project, Ravenhof, is located on the center of the city, while the other two are located on the south of the city, not too far from each other. Again, they have very different special configurations in terms of design and in terms of how they relate to their neighborhoods. Starting for Ravenhof, we see a big difference between the other projects, because in terms of a global scale, these projects are well located in the center of Vienna, and the streets surrounding the project show high values of integration and choice. because of course we are talking about one of the main important zones in Vienna, but it also speaks with the local levels that compared to the London project, it doesn't show that this the project at itself connects to the neighborhoods with the streets aligned with how the people will move. And this is something that we can see in the Natch 800 picture on the left of the screen. Going then to the software project, at a global scale, we can see that still has a good connections in terms of choice and integration. Natch states for choice, 9 for integration. And the connection at a local level, it starts to decline due to this design that these passages are not so well integrated as the project before on Ravenhof. Finally, in Ella Linshof, that is the newest project in Vienna, we can see that at global scale, this has a main street on the east connecting the project to the rest of the city at both the metrics. And finally, at a local scale, due to its location and this far away from the center of the city, we start to see this decline in the values of integration and choice. But summarizing these whole findings in a single table, we can get 3 important results from the values that the space syntax analysis can provide to us. First, that despite what we saw on the public discourse and on the previous background, London projects are not so segregated using the space syntax methodology as we told in terms of value. Using the median value of all the projects, we see that at a global scale, it has even higher values than the location on the projects of Vienna. Obviously, this is will be because of the size of the city of London, but on the local scale and on choice 10,000, we see that the values doesn't differ too much from city to city. This is an interesting finding because it's counterintuitive to think with all this public discourse that the London projects were so not well located compared to the Vienna projects, but here we can compare them and see that they got both similar values. And also comparing results on a time period basis and not on a city to city basis, we can see a clear pattern in the way that through history, the values of integration and choice is like where if the projects are becoming a centrality or the projects are well connected from part to part, are declining, obviously because the space is not the same as before, and the locations where the projects are going to be located are far and far away from the city center. So this is something very interesting that we found about the location of a project that could not mean that the location on Vienna social housing is better than the London social housing, but each one has their own characteristics. We also wanted to map this on a scatter plots to see which is the relationship between the global scale and local scale. On the space syntax actual analysis, this was called intelligibility, and wanted to show how easy it is to connect it from the local to the global. And in all 6 projects, we see a similar pattern with the segments at the edge of the project have higher values in both the scales, local and global, and the streets on the interior have lower values on the linear strength. Comparing 2 specific projects, Maiden Lane Estate with Ravenhof, we can see the similarities on the configuration of this relationship between local and global. But the big difference here is the R2 value of correlation that we got, because it's usually said that with the higher the value is, it's easier to connect the local environment with the global environment, is in other words, the neighborhood with the city. But in London, we see higher values than in Vienna. It's not itself because maybe these projects are more well connected between local and global, but by the whole configuration of the city by itself. That could help or not help to happen this. Knowing this background that we already take the space syntax methodology, we also wanted to test to what extent this relates to the land uses and how this important factor is also relevant to know if a project is successful or a failure in terms of public discourse. For this, we use as a theoretical background, we should use the movement economy by Bill Hillier that states that the space organization generates a distribution of movement patterns. This distribution of patterns generates that the land uses choices happen in these places. And at the end, the grid adapts itself to more intensive development due to the more people are walking through this area. And of course, also backing up on the theories of Jane Jacobs that say that mixed land uses are one of the 4 pillars to have a vibrant urban area or urban city, if you can call it. Here, we use the power of data science to extract the land uses located in all the projects with open available data from OpenStreetMaps and privately available data from Google Maps in order to see how we can cluster these land uses and how what this information tells us about each project. Here we are going to bring just 2 projects, Maiden Lane and Robin Hood, which really show the difference between what is the relationship with the neighborhood. In terms of density of units per kilometers and units per flat, in Maiden Lane, we see very low values of density, pretty concentrated in shop, gastronomy, and service. And it's important to mention here that important land uses for community fosters such as health, education, or culture has very lower values. And this compared to Ramejo, we can see a big difference of how land uses is located, because here we map the land uses on an 800 meters radius that is pretty much a distance that is comfortable for the residents of the projects to walk by. And we can see that the density of the units per kilometer and units per flat is much higher, and with a special focus on this kind of community service such as health, education, that is much higher than before. Comparing these 2 projects in terms of density of land uses, we can see a clear difference between the social housing project at Maiden Lane in London and social housing project in Ramejo, that perhaps in this case is very dramatic. In the other project is not the same, but it shows how the land uses have a huge effect on perhaps the perception of how we see these projects, because we have land uses that are accessible at one and the other scale.
We were also interested to take a look at the smaller scale. So we looked at the ground floor spaces from a more architectural point of view. And what you're going to see now are from each project the ground floors. And what is white is publicly accessible, so streets, but also public uses or uses for the community who is living there. And gray, you find housing on the ground floor, or uses that are really only for the people that are living there, so not publicly accessible for anybody else. And when we compare boundary estate with Rabenhof, it's interesting to see that, as we mentioned also before, they both follow a street pattern, and they both form kind of courtyards which allow to go through. The special thing about Rabenhof is also that it has also the possibility to go through the buildings to enter the courtyard. So there are many openings. It's very much permeable, and Rabenhof even has also uses which, like a theater, which is really attracting people from the whole city. And when we compare the next 2 projects from the post-war era, Maiden Lane and Shopwerk, I have to say Maiden Lane, there's a small mistake. So actually there should be more buildings in gray. Please ignore this. So what we see here is that both have a grid-like structure. Maiden Lane also has a street grid, and Schöpfwerk is much more on the open spaces are much more like surface-like. So you have endless options to cross the site. And parts of the buildings are also elevated, so you can go through the buildings. And in the northern part, you have a focus on public amenities, and the southern part is very, very differently behaving. So much more housing functions. And the next project, the next couple, the youngest ones, you see already what the big difference in size is. So McGrath Road is actually a building. So is also Ella Lingenshof, or it's a set of buildings, but it's a much smaller size. And McGrath Road has only housing on the ground floor, and the courtyard is cut off from the public space. So they have gates which are locked. And Ella Lingenshof is very different. It's completely public. You can go everywhere. And maybe now you can see it a little bit better. So you have really this L-shaped courtyard. You have really staircases which are cascading downwards. So you really have like an arena where is a playground located. So a very different kind of open space that you can find there. So when we are summing up now our different levels of analysis, Gustavo, I don't know, maybe we probably shouldn't repeat ourselves. Gustavo, do you want to continue?
Yeah, so, well, pretty much this is a summary of all the analysis that we show you in terms of location, uses, and ground. And again, we don't want to repeat pretty much all the what we already said, but how over the time London and Vienna has had a relationship in the way that the development of social housing, from projects that were on the center of the city with high density, with a kind of a street party design, later passing to a post-World War II era where the modern style create this kind of grid-like street projects that were still located kind of in the center of the city, but the levels of integration and location like shift a little bit from the early projects and now to the 2000s, where we have a completely different style, where the location is far away due to land constraints, the uses around it is very low, and the ground floor pretty much they are just focusing on the buildings and not itself on creating a project that is related to the city. But it summarized that even though different cities, different public discourse in terms of spatial and ground floor, despite has a similar, different public discourse have very similarities in terms of spatial characteristics. Christina, I don't know if you want to add something else there.
No, I think we can go to the next slide because I think we talked quite a long. So yeah, or maybe just so for a second the slide before that we can see all of the projects next to each other, where we can again see this comparison of size, which is really, I would say, we really picked like characteristic projects of these times. And it's really interesting to read these projects either from left to right and from top to bottom and compare them to each other. And then to our final slide. So, I mean, of course, our research is just, yeah, I would say there are we found many points where we would think to continue. So we would be interesting to continue on more the neighborhood and architectural scale, to look more at the visibility and accessibility of these estates, the question of where entrances are located. So we think that these are really decisive elements. And in general, we also think that this research or continuing this research is so relevant in the context of the current developments, because as we said at the beginning, there is really pressure to produce more social housing, to build new ones, but also to refurbish existing estates, to densify them. And these are all reasons why it's important to look at what has been done before. And then what is also very much changing now, the situation, are these new ways of financing social housing, where different kinds of flats, ownership, a combination of ownership and rent brings a mixture of inhabitants. So we probably won't have the situation anymore where you have a large project where you only have people with similar kind of income and similar kind of problems. So this is something which is going to change. And then also, of course, the building ground in cities is limited. That's why we see that projects are getting smaller and are getting more at the edges of the cities. So I think these are all tendencies that we should consider when we evaluate the existing projects that, have been done before.
Yep, I think, well, this research was just a small part of a big discussion about social housing, but we wanted to thank you very much for listening to us. And if you have any questions or comments, our contacts are on the screen.